No one expected this moment on live TV, but within seconds, the entire room shifted. What happens when a routine conversation on live television takes an unexpected turn? Not because anyone planned it, but because two people simply see the world differently and neither backs away. Make sure to subscribe to Table Turn and like and comment for more real talk show coverage. On this particular morning, the set of The View looked exactly as it always does. Bright lights, a full studio audience settling into their seats, the panel chatting lightly as the cameras counted down. There was nothing in the opening moments to suggest that this episode would end up being talked about long after the credits rolled. Brad Pitt was the scheduled guest, there to promote a new film project and to talk, in the familiar daytime way, about his career, producing work, and the stage of life he finds himself in now. Sonny Hostin, along with the rest of the panel, welcomed him warmly, and the first several minutes moved at the comfortable pace viewers expect from the show. Brad Pitt came out to applause that filled the studio, the kind of sustained, polite enthusiasm that signals a guest the audience already knows and feels comfortable with. He waved, smiled, exchanged greetings with each host, and settled into his chair. The early questions were light and professional. Joy Behar joked about how long he's been in the public eye. Whoopi Goldberg framed his career in terms of longevity and reinvention. Sonny Hostin asked about producing versus acting, steering the conversation toward how much creative control actors really have in Hollywood today. Brad answered thoughtfully, measured, clearly in familiar territory. His body language was relaxed, leaning forward slightly, hands loosely clasped, making eye contact with whoever was speaking. The shift didn't happen all at once. It began subtly, during a discussion about the responsibility public figures have when talking about social issues. Sonny Hostin brought up a recent interview Brad had given elsewhere, where he spoke about staying mostly private and choosing his words carefully in public. She framed it as a contrast to celebrities who speak out loudly and often. At first, Brad agreed in general terms, saying that everyone has their own comfort level and that he tends to be reflective rather than outspoken. The exchange was calm, respectful, and very much in line with the tone of daytime television. But as Sonny continued, her questions became more pointed. She asked whether choosing to stay quiet, especially when you have influence, can itself be a kind of statement. The studio audience reacted with a few murmurs, the kind that signal interest rather than discomfort. Brad paused before answering, taking a moment that felt noticeable on live TV. He explained that he believes listening can sometimes be more valuable than speaking and that he doesn't assume his voice is always the most important one in the room. Sonny nodded, but didn't move on. She leaned slightly forward, hands resting on the table, her tone still calm but more direct. She talked about her background as a lawyer and journalist, about accountability, and about how silence from influential people can feel disappointing to those who are looking for support. This is where viewers could sense the energy change. The pacing slowed. Other panelists shifted in their seats. Joy glanced briefly toward Whoopi, as if gauging whether to interject. Brad responded by emphasizing personal boundaries, saying that he's careful not to comment on things he hasn't fully educated himself about. His voice remained even, but his posture changed just a bit. He sat back, shoulders squaring, signaling that he was now more aware of the tension in the conversation. The audience stayed quiet, attentive, listening closely to each word. Sonny followed up again, asking whether that caution ever crosses into avoidance. She made it clear she wasn't accusing him of anything specific, but the implication was there, and it hung in the air. Brad smiled politely, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. He replied that he thinks there's a danger in expecting entertainers to become moral authorities and that he's uncomfortable with that expectation. At this point, the conversation had clearly moved beyond promotion and into something more personal and philosophical. Whoopi attempted to widen the lens, jumping in to say that everyone approaches activism differently and that there's room for many styles of engagement. Her interruption was gentle, clearly meant to ease the tension, and for a brief moment it worked. Brad nodded in agreement. Sonny listened, but didn't fully let the point go. She returned to her earlier question, reframing it slightly, and asked how Brad reconciles his platform with his preference for privacy. Her tone was steady, not confrontational, but firm. The studio audience reacted again, a few audible gasps mixed with quiet applause from scattered seats. This was the moment viewers later pointed to as the clear turning point. Brad took a longer pause this time. He looked down briefly, then back up, choosing his words carefully. He said that he believes his work speaks for him more than his opinions, and that he tries to contribute behind the scenes in ways that don't always make headlines. His voice was still calm, but there was a noticeable seriousness now, a sense that he felt misunderstood. Sonny listened, then responded by saying that transparency matters, and that for many people watching, public figures help shape conversations whether they intend to or not. Her expression was thoughtful, but unyielding. The back and forth had become more direct, less buffered by humor or light commentary. Joy attempted a small joke to break the tension, but it landed softly and didn't fully shift the mood. As the exchange continued, body language told as much of the story as the words. Brad's hands, once relaxed, now rested firmly on his knees. Sonny's posture remained forward, engaged, signaling that she was fully invested in the discussion. Whoopi watched closely, ready to step in if needed. The studio audience stayed unusually quiet for a daytime show, clearly aware they were witnessing an unscripted, real moment. Eventually, Whoopi stepped in more decisively, thanking Brad for his honesty and steering the conversation back toward his film and creative process. The transition was smooth on the surface, but the energy in the room had undeniably shifted. Brad answered the new questions professionally, but the earlier tension lingered just beneath the surface, detectable in the shorter responses and more reserved demeanor. As the segment wrapped up, applause filled the studio, polite and appreciative, but slightly more subdued than at the start. Brad thanked the hosts, exchanged brief smiles, and exited the stage. The panel moved on to the next topic, but viewers at home could still feel the echo of what had just happened. Later that day, clips of the exchange began circulating online. Viewers debated whether Sonny's questions were fair or whether Brad had been put on the spot unnecessarily. Some praised the conversation for being thoughtful and honest. Others felt it was uncomfortable to watch. Social media filled with commentary, hashtags, and short clips capturing the most tense moments. On the following episode, the hosts briefly addressed the segment, emphasizing that The View is a place for open discussion and differing perspectives. The moment didn't end with raised voices or dramatic walk-offs. Instead, it lingered because it felt real. Two people speaking calmly, firmly, and honestly in front of a live audience, navigating a disagreement in real time. And that's why it stood out. If you watched it live, you could feel the room change. And if you caught it later, you probably replayed it more than once. As always, share your opinion in the comments and subscribe to Table Turn for more narration-based talk show stories. As the show moved past that first exchange, what stood out to viewers was how the atmosphere didn't snap back to normal right away. Live television has a rhythm, and when that rhythm is disrupted, even briefly, everyone on set feels it. The cameras stayed wide a little longer than usual, catching small moments that normally wouldn't register with an audience at home. Sonny adjusted her papers, glancing down as if grounding herself before the next topic. Whoopi leaned back, hands folded, watching Brad closely as he answered the safer, more neutral questions that followed. Brad himself remained composed, but there was a noticeable shift in how he spoke. His answers became shorter, more carefully framed, with fewer personal asides. The discussion about his film project continued, but it no longer felt like the main event. Viewers could sense that both the hosts and the guest were aware of what had just occurred and were consciously trying to keep things steady. Joy Behar chimed in with a question about working with younger actors, injecting humor and warmth, and Brad responded politely, even smiling at one point. The audience laughed, but it was lighter, more restrained, as if everyone was still recalibrating. Sonny stayed quieter for a few minutes, listening rather than leading. When she did speak again, her tone was softer, her questions broader and less pointed. She asked about collaboration and mentorship, framing it as a general industry question rather than a personal one. Brad answered comfortably, and for a moment, it seemed like the tension had fully passed. But then, in a way that felt almost accidental, the earlier topic resurfaced. Whoopi mentioned the responsibility that comes with producing content that reaches millions of people. It wasn't a challenge, more of an observation, but it naturally connected back to the earlier discussion. Brad acknowledged it, saying that he takes that responsibility seriously and that he thinks a lot about what stories he helps bring into the world. Sunny nodded and added a brief comment about storytelling being a form of influence. It was short, measured, and not confrontational, but the audience reacted with a murmur that suggested they remembered exactly where this conversation had been just minutes earlier. Brad glanced toward Sunny, then back to Whoopi, choosing to respond in general terms again. He spoke about intention and humility, about not wanting to overshadow voices that deserve to be heard more directly. What made this part of the segment compelling wasn't any single line, but the accumulation of small signals. The slight pauses before answers. The careful phrasing. The way panelists took turns more deliberately, leaving space between comments. These are the things regular viewers notice, even if they can't always articulate them. It felt like everyone was walking a little more carefully, aware of the live audience and the potential for misunderstanding. Behind the scenes, producers are always listening, ready to cue a commercial break if things veer too far off course. In this case, they didn't need to. The conversation remained respectful, if serious, and stayed within the bounds of daytime television. Still, when the segment finally did go to break, the relief was subtle but real. The applause as the music came up was stronger than it had been moments earlier, signaling a collective exhale from the room. When the show returned from commercial, Brad was still on the couch, but the tone was clearly reset. Whoopi opened with a lighter comment, thanking him for staying with them and for being open. Brad smiled and thanked the panel in return. Sunny echoed that sentiment, saying she appreciated thoughtful answers and meaningful conversation. The exchange felt like a quiet acknowledgement that something real had happened, without rehashing it on air. From a viewer's perspective, this was a classic example of how live talk shows manage tension. There was no apology, no dramatic clarification, just a mutual understanding that different perspectives had been shared. The audience responded positively, applauding at appropriate moments, signaling their support for open discussion. As the segment wrapped for good, Brad stood, shook hands with each host, and addressed the audience directly, thanking them for their time. His demeanor was warm and professional, and whatever discomfort had surfaced earlier was no longer visible on the surface. He exited to applause that felt genuine and appreciative. Once the cameras cut away from the guest segment and moved on to the panel's next discussion, viewers at home were left processing what they had seen. This wasn't a blow-up or a viral shouting match. It was something subtler and in many ways more relatable. Two people with different views, speaking calmly but firmly in a space designed for conversation. Almost immediately after the episode aired, social media began filling with short clips of the exchange. Some focused on Sunny's questions, praising her for pressing the issue respectfully. Others highlighted Brad's responses, applauding his commitment to privacy and thoughtful engagement. Comment sections filled with long threads debating whether public figures owe audiences their opinions, or whether restraint is itself a form of responsibility. What's interesting is how divided the reaction was, not along predictable lines, but based on personal expectations of celebrities and talk shows. Some viewers said this was exactly why they watched The View, for moments where conversations feel unscripted and real. Others said they tune in for lighter fare and found the exchange uncomfortable. The hosts themselves addressed the moment indirectly later that week. Sunny, in a separate interview, spoke about the importance of asking hard questions while remaining respectful. She emphasized that disagreement doesn't have to mean hostility. Brad, during another promotional stop, was asked about appearing on daytime television and spoke generally about enjoying thoughtful conversations, without referencing the moment specifically. Looking back, the reason this segment stayed in people's minds wasn't because of what was said, but because of how it was said. There were no raised voices, no personal attacks, just a clear difference in perspective that played out in real time. In an era where televised disagreements often feel performative, this one stood out for being restrained and authentic. For regular viewers, it was a reminder that live television is unpredictable, not because of chaos, but because of honesty. And for those who caught it after the fact, it offered a glimpse into how real conversations unfold when no one fully scripts the outcome. As the discussion continues online and among viewers, it's clear that moments like this resonate because they reflect real-life conversations many people have every day. Different views, shared respectfully, even when they're uncomfortable. And now it's your turn. Share your opinion in the comments and subscribe to Table Turn for more narration-based talk show stories. In the days following the episode, what made this particular exchange linger wasn't just the initial live moment, but how it kept revealing new layers the more people talked about it. Viewers who rewatched the segment noticed details they'd missed the first time, the kind of small, human cues that only stand out in hindsight. The way Sunny paused before certain questions, clearly choosing her words carefully. The way Brad slightly nodded while listening, even when he disagreed, signaling that he was engaged rather than defensive. These details mattered because they reinforced that this wasn't a confrontation engineered for television, but a real conversation unfolding without a clear roadmap. On the show itself, the panel's dynamic after Brad left also told its own story. When the hosts transitioned to their next topic, there was a brief adjustment period. Whoopi took a slightly more guiding role, summarizing points before opening the floor. Joy leaned into humor again, but in a gentler way, as if consciously easing the mood. Sunny spoke with the same confidence she always does, but with a tone that suggested reflection rather than argument. To the casual viewer, it might have seemed like a normal continuation of the program. To longtime fans, it felt like a subtle recalibration. One of the things audiences discussed most was Sunny's approach. She didn't interrupt Brad mid-sentence or raise her voice. Instead, she let him finish, then followed up with questions that were clearly prepared but flexible. That's a skill honed over years in journalism and law, and it showed. Some viewers appreciated that she didn't let the conversation stay surface level. Others felt that daytime talk shows should prioritize comfort over challenge. This split reaction played out across social media platforms in real time. Brad's role in the exchange was equally scrutinized. Many viewers commented on how composed he remained, even as the questions edged closer to personal philosophy. His answers didn't sound rehearsed, but they were careful. He didn't dismiss Sunny's perspective outright. Instead, he reframed it through his own values, emphasizing restraint and intentionality. For fans who admire him for his low-key public presence, this reinforced their perception of him. For critics, it raised questions about whether thoughtfulness can sometimes look like distance. What's interesting is how the studio audience functioned almost like a character in the moment. Early on, they reacted with polite laughter and applause, as expected. As the discussion deepened, their reactions became more subdued. You could hear small murmurs, a few scattered claps after certain points, but mostly attentive silence. That silence is telling on daytime television, where audiences are usually encouraged to be expressive. It suggested that people were listening closely, weighing what they were hearing rather than immediately reacting. Producers later noted, in off-air comments, that moments like this are always tricky to manage live. There's no script to fall back on, no guarantee of where the conversation will go. The goal is to let it breathe without letting it spiral. In this case, the balance held. The hosts didn't shut it down, but they also didn't push it into uncomfortable territory. That restraint is part of what made the exchange feel authentic rather than explosive. As clips circulated, some media outlets framed the moment as a clash, while others described it as a thoughtful disagreement. The language used mattered because it shaped how people approached the clip before even watching it. Those expecting drama might have been disappointed. Those interested in nuanced conversation found plenty to unpack. This difference in framing became part of the broader conversation about how we consume and interpret televised moments. Sunny addressed the episode again during a later broadcast, not by naming Brad directly, but by talking about the importance of diverse viewpoints on the show. She said that the view exists to reflect the kinds of conversations happening around kitchen tables and workplaces across the country. She emphasized that disagreement, when handled respectfully, can be productive. Her comments were measured, clearly intended to affirm the show's mission rather than revisit any specific tension. Brad, for his part, didn't dwell on the moment publicly. In subsequent interviews promoting his film, he spoke about storytelling, collaboration, and the value of listening. When asked generally about appearing on talk shows, he mentioned enjoying spaces where ideas can be exchanged without hostility. He didn't criticize or praise the exchange explicitly, which some viewers interpreted as consistency with the very philosophy he'd expressed on the show. The conversation also sparked broader discussions about the role of daytime talk shows in shaping public discourse. Some longtime viewers expressed appreciation that The View still allows space for serious topics amid lighter segments. Others questioned whether celebrity interviews are the right venue for such discussions. This debate isn't new, but moments like this bring it back into focus, reminding audiences that these shows walk a fine line between entertainment and engagement. From a pacing standpoint, the original segment is now often cited as an example of how tension can build slowly without tipping into spectacle. There was no single dramatic line, no moment where voices rose or tempers flared. Instead, the tension emerged from contrast. Sonny's belief in the responsibility of public voices contrasted with Brad's belief in personal boundaries. Neither position was extreme, and that's what made the exchange relatable. Many viewers saw their own internal debates reflected on the screen. Another aspect people noted was the mutual respect maintained throughout. Even when Sonny pressed a point, she acknowledged Brad's perspective. Even when Brad pushed back, he did so without dismissiveness. That mutual respect set a tone that allowed the conversation to remain grounded. In an era where disagreements often escalate quickly, this restraint stood out. As days passed, the clip's momentum slowed, replaced by longer-form commentary and think pieces. Analysts discussed the implications of celebrity silence, the expectations placed on public figures, and the role of talk shows in navigating these issues. What started as a few minutes of live television had expanded into a broader cultural discussion, not because of controversy, but because of sincerity. For viewers who watch live, the memory of the moment is tied to how it felt in real time. The slight tightening in the room, the sense that something unscripted was happening. For those who watched later, the context mattered. Knowing that this wasn't a staged confrontation changed how they interpreted the exchange. It became less about choosing sides and more about understanding perspectives. As the conversation continued to ripple outward, another layer emerged that viewers began to focus on, and that was how the moment fit into the broader pattern of The View as a show. Longtime viewers are used to spirited debates, but they're also accustomed to a certain rhythm. Guests come on, promote a project, share a few personal anecdotes, and maybe touch lightly on current events. What happened with Brad Pitt and Sonny Hostin didn't break that format, but it stretched it in a way that felt noticeable. The discussion didn't derail the show, but it nudged it into a space where the lines between celebrity, responsibility, and personal philosophy blurred just enough to make people lean in. One thing people pointed out repeatedly was how the other hosts managed their roles in that moment. Whoopi Goldberg, as moderator, never shut the conversation down, but she also didn't let it become a back and forth that excluded the rest of the table. Her interjections were brief and strategic, designed to widen the lens rather than take sides. When she spoke, her tone suggested perspective gained from years of navigating live television and unpredictable conversations. She let Sonny ask her questions and Brad answer them, but she kept the temperature from rising. Joy Behar's role was different, but equally important. Her attempts to inject humor weren't dismissive of the seriousness of the discussion. Instead, they served as pressure valves, small moments that reminded everyone that this was still daytime television, still a space meant to be accessible. Even when her jokes didn't fully land, they signaled an effort to keep the room from becoming too heavy. That balance is something audiences often take for granted until it's tested. Sonny, meanwhile, became the focal point of much of the post-show discussion. Supporters praised her for doing what they believe a journalist should do, asking questions that go beyond surface-level promotion. Critics argued that the timing wasn't right, that a celebrity interview isn't the place for such pointed philosophical questions. What both sides seemed to agree on, however, was that her approach was calm and deliberate. She didn't appear interested in creating a viral moment. She appeared interested in an answer. Brad's presence in that exchange also shaped how it was received. Had the guest been less composed, the moment might have escalated differently. Instead, his measured responses kept the conversation grounded. Even when he disagreed, he acknowledged Sonny's perspective, which prevented the discussion from turning personal. Viewers who watched closely noticed that he never raised his voice or dismissed the premise of her questions outright. That restraint mattered, especially in a format where emotions can sometimes run high. Another aspect that became clearer over time was how much the studio audience influenced the flow of the segment. Their reactions, or lack thereof, created a feedback loop that both the hosts and Brad seemed to register in real time. When applause was light or delayed, it signaled uncertainty. When the room went quiet, it created space for the words to carry more weight. Live audiences are often encouraged to react enthusiastically, so their restraint in this moment stood out as a sign that they, too, were processing rather than reacting. Television analysts later noted that moments like this are a reminder of why live formats still matter. In an age of heavily edited content and curated clips, there's something revealing about watching people think on their feet. There's no opportunity to rewrite an answer or soften a question once it's been asked. What viewers saw was exactly what happened, with all the pauses, overlaps, and subtle shifts that come with real conversation. In the days that followed, The View's producers reportedly received a wide range of feedback. Some viewers wrote in to praise the show for allowing a thoughtful exchange to unfold without interruption. Others expressed discomfort, saying they watched the show for a sense of ease and familiarity, not tension. The producers acknowledged the feedback but stood by the segment, emphasizing that the show has always been a place for differing perspectives. Sonny addressed the moment again, this time during a panel discussion about media responsibility. Without naming Brad or revisiting specifics, she talked about the importance of asking questions that reflect viewers' concerns. She emphasized that respectful disagreement is not only inevitable but necessary in meaningful conversations. Her comments suggested reflection rather than defensiveness, reinforcing the idea that the exchange had been taken seriously, not brushed off. Brad's silence on the specific moment continued to be interpreted in different ways. Some saw it as consistency with his stated values. Others wished he had engaged more directly with the public reaction. But even that silence became part of the conversation, highlighting the very issue that had been discussed on air. Expectations placed on public figures don't end when the cameras stop rolling, and how they respond, or don't respond, becomes part of their public narrative. What's worth noting is that the segment didn't result in any visible rift. There were no reports of backstage tension, no statements suggesting anyone felt ambushed or disrespected. By all accounts, the interaction ended professionally, with mutual thanks exchanged off-camera. That professionalism reinforced the idea that what viewers saw was a genuine exchange of ideas, not a manufactured conflict. As more time passed, the moment settled into a different kind of memory. It wasn't referenced constantly, but it lingered as an example. Commentators would bring it up when discussing how talk shows can handle serious topics without crossing into sensationalism. Media students analyzed it as a case study in live interview dynamics. Fans of the show cited it as proof that unscripted television can still surprise them in quiet, meaningful ways. For many viewers, the takeaway wasn't about who was right or wrong. It was about the value of listening. Watching two people articulate their perspectives calmly, even when they didn't align, felt refreshing to some and uncomfortable to others. That discomfort, however, wasn't rooted in hostility. It came from seeing a conversation that didn't offer easy answers. By the time Part 4 of this story unfolds, the initial tension has long since dissipated, replaced by reflection and discussion. The moment has been contextualized, debated, and, in some cases, defended. It has become part of the larger tapestry of live television moments that remind audiences why they still tune in. Not for perfection, but for authenticity. And that's where this segment ultimately landed. Not as a controversy, but as a conversation that asked viewers to think, even if only for a few minutes, about what they expect from the people they watch and the platforms that host them. By the time the episode fully wrapped and the credits rolled, the feeling in the studio was noticeably different from how the hour had begun. The final segment of the show moved along smoothly, with the panel discussing a lighter topic, but there was still a sense that something meaningful had taken place earlier. The audience applauded on cue, laughed when appropriate, and followed the familiar rhythm of the program, yet the earlier exchange seemed to linger in the room. It wasn't heavy or unresolved, just present, the way a thoughtful conversation can stay with you even after you've moved on to something else. When the show officially ended and the cameras stopped recording, there was no visible tension among the hosts. According to people who were in the audience that day, the panel exchanged brief off-camera comments and smiles, the kind that suggest mutual respect rather than discomfort. Brad Pitt had already left the set, but there was no sense of an abrupt or awkward exit. Everything about the ending felt professional, orderly, and calm, reinforcing the idea that what viewers saw was simply a real discussion handled in real time. The studio audience reaction immediately after the segment was telling. As people filtered out, conversations buzzed quietly. Some attendees later shared that they appreciated being part of a moment that felt unscripted and thoughtful. Others admitted they weren't quite sure how they felt about it yet, which in itself speaks to the impact. Rarely does a daytime talk show exchange leave viewers unsure of their reaction. That uncertainty, for many, was what made it memorable. Once the episode aired nationally, the viewer response unfolded in waves. In the first few hours, short clips circulated online, often focusing on the key questions and Brad's most measured responses. The comments under those clips reflected a wide range of reactions. Some viewers praised Sunny Hostin for asking questions they felt were relevant and overdue. Others felt Brad Pitt handled the moment with grace and composure. A third group questioned whether the conversation belonged in that setting at all. What stood out was how few responses were purely dismissive. Most people engaged thoughtfully, even when they disagreed. Later that evening, longer discussions began appearing across social platforms and forums. Viewers dissected tone, word choice, and body language. Some noted how the absence of raised voices made the disagreement feel more authentic. Others pointed out how rare it is to see a celebrity interview drift into philosophical territory without being framed as a debate. Media commentators weighed in, not to declare a winner, but to analyze how the exchange reflected broader cultural expectations. The following day, daytime television recap shows and entertainment news segments briefly referenced the moment. Most described it as a tense but respectful exchange or a thoughtful disagreement. The language used was careful, avoiding sensational labels. That framing mattered because it shaped how new viewers approached the clip. Those who hadn't seen it live were less likely to expect drama and more likely to watch with an open mind. On the next episode of The View, the hosts didn't revisit the exchange in detail, but they did make a brief, general acknowledgement. Whoopi mentioned the importance of allowing space for different perspectives, especially when conversations are happening live. Sunny nodded in agreement and added that meaningful dialogue isn't always comfortable, but it can be valuable. The comments were brief and non-specific, signaling closure rather than continuation. Behind the scenes, there were no reports of fallout or conflict. No statements were released. No corrections were issued. The absence of damage control was, in many ways, the strongest indication that the moment hadn't crossed any lines. It had simply done what live television sometimes does best, allow people to speak honestly without knowing exactly where the conversation will land. In the days that followed, Brad Pitt continued his promotional tour, and Sunny Hostin continued her work on the show and in journalism. Neither made the exchange a focal point of their public appearances. And yet, the moment continued to be referenced by viewers as an example of what they appreciate about live talk shows. Not the drama, but the unpredictability. Not the conflict, but the authenticity. What ultimately defined this on-air moment was how it ended, not with resolution or agreement, but with mutual respect. The segment concluded without apologies or explanations because none were needed. The conversation had run its course naturally. The audience had been trusted to draw their own conclusions, and the show had moved on, as live television always does. For some viewers, the exchange reinforced their loyalty to The View as a place where real conversations can happen. For others, it challenged their expectations of what daytime television should feel like. Both reactions are valid, and both were reflected in the broader response. That range of interpretation is part of why the moment resonated beyond its original broadcast. Looking back, it's clear that this wasn't an on-air blow-up or a headline-driven controversy. It was a reminder that even within the polished environment of a daytime talk show, unscripted moments can still happen. Moments where people speak thoughtfully, listen carefully, and disagree without turning away from one another. Those moments don't always trend the fastest, but they tend to last longer in memory. And that's why this exchange continues to be discussed. Not because it shocked viewers, but because it felt real. A routine conversation took an unexpected turn, and instead of spiraling, it settled into something reflective and human. In the world of live television, that's no small thing. Now it's your turn. Share their opinion in the comments and subscribe to Table Turn for more narration-based talk show stories.